Higurashi Sotsu is the continuation to the 2020 reboot but actually a sequel anime series that everyone was really excited about a while ago. Now Higurashi is already a huge franchise, and while marketing Go as a reboot wasn't a great decision in its own right, Higurashi Sotsu was where the problems really started coming in spades. I've been a fan of Higurashi for a very long time now, and I had full hopes that this new series would be a great entry into a franchise I already loved, but unfortunately that didn't exactly come to pass. I hope that by the end of this video, I can get across just how many bad decisions have been realized in Sotsu and its shoddy execution. I put this as a series of 7 flaws. Why? Cause 7's a cool number, I just kinda like it. Anyway, let's get started.
It's gonna be great.
That's gonna be great.
It's gonna be great.
That's gonna be great.
王妻学園生徒会開塞一つ
As a surprise sequel to the original series, going into Go and Sotsu, I was looking for re-examinations of things touched upon in the first series to go along with original story content. And Go ostensibly tried to follow through with this. Series author Ryukishi09 said in an interview that the intention behind Go and Sotsu was to live up to a frequent fan request, a wish to erase their memory so that they can experience the story all over again. Now this is a nice and heartwarming goal, but in execution all this series has really done is demonstrate how to not do this kind of thing. Ryukishi's writing style has always played at a type of subversion. He intentionally sets up a period of positivity and closeness and then breaks it apart with a spat of psychological horror, and then vacillates between these two tones. Typically this plays well. In Higurashi you'll get scenes where the club members grow closer and then some weird paranoia takes hold and questions everything you just saw. It's a masterclass in the concept of recontextualizing. For example, in the first story arc of Higurashi, Onikakushi Hen, after spending a lot of time setting up the friendships between characters Keiichi, Reina, and Mion, there's a point at which Keiichi becomes suspicious because Reina and Mion have been hiding part of the town's history from him. Since we get the story through Keiichi's paranoia, his friendship with Reina and Mion is thrown into question. What's really going on? Why are they lying to him? He starts to skip school, pretending to be ill, and Reina and Mion visit his house to give him a get-well present. Again, since we see this through Keiichi's paranoid view, this gift is seen as some kind of initial attack, and Keiichi genuinely starts to believe the two are trying to kill him. When these scenes are revisited later in the series, we can see where a paranoid Keiichi could come to these unfortunate conclusions, but we can also see the innocent side of these interactions. See, recontextualizing only works if there's an unknown to be found in revisiting a scene, a mystery to be solved, a motivation to be explored. This was part of the core concept of Higurashi, constantly giving life to old scenes through slow reveals of information that provide context that couldn't be gleaned the first time through. Go seems to set this up in the same way, providing that same sway between periods of calm and periods of violence. However, when it came time for Sotsu to deliver on providing greater context, it came up woefully short. And this is in no small part due to Sotsu's inability to indicate important elements to be recontextualized at later dates. To put this in perspective,
王妻学園生徒会開塞二つ
the gun cliffhanger is the final scene of Higurashi Go's 17th episode, the finale of Nekodamashi Hen. Rika organizes a birthday party for Satoko, and when she tries to give Satoko her present, she instinctively ducks. This is a quite clever callback to the very first episode of the series. In that timeline, Rika gave Satoko a present in that same box, only for Satoko to learn it was booby-trapped to punch her with a toy glove. Satoko, anticipating the same prank, ducks when she sees the box again. This is the turning point. This is when Rika realizes that Satoko has the same time loop powers that she has. Satoko pulls a gun on Rika and the episode ends. Bear in mind, the gun cliffhanger aired on January 28th. Ever since then, fans have been waiting for its resolution. The episodes of Go that followed this all take place well before Nekodamashi, so this scene wouldn't be revisited until Sotsu. And then Sotsu aired. Let's play a game real quick. Sotsu is 15 episodes long. Take a guess as to which episode the gun cliffhanger was revisited in. I'll give you a few seconds. If you guessed the 14th episode, then congratulations, you've earned a nice sniff of Ryukishi's finest.
That smells like ass.
The show isn't good. The early use of this cliffhanger, and the following arc being a prequel to it, sets up an implication that this scene is actually going to be important, like the story will really be going somewhere once we get back to it. What was actually going to happen when we return to this moment? The silly joke answer to that question would be Satoko just shoots Rika and we move on. This is a shockingly poor use of the cliffhanger as a narrative device, and upon going through the episodes that follow, it seems like it was only used this way to keep people invested through an entire season of recap episodes. So yeah, let's get into that.
王西学園生徒会開則3つ
Like I mentioned earlier, when this new series first began airing, it was originally marketed as a remake of the original stories. The first episode leaned into this. Its story followed the start of the originals quite closely, and they even brought back the original opening as an ending song, and it was all really cool. And then at the very end, they dropped a gotcha. This was actually a sequel all along. Now, even this was pretty cool at first. I and many others went from being excited to see this series be given a more sophisticated adaptation to being excited to see it get a brand new continuation. The problem here is that Ryukishi later said that this new series would be a good entry point for newcomers?
Excuse me, what?
Let's look at this series from the perspective of a newcomer real quick, okay? We open with Go, and again, it's a strong start, mostly because it's just the original story, but hey, there's a couple new things sprinkled in, like in episode 2, where newbies are given an early introduction to the supernatural elements of Higurashi. Who is this Hanyu? What is this place? Interesting questions. We won't be addressing them. This problem actually only gets worse with the introduction of Eiwa, who is arguably the worst addition to this franchise, but I'll get into her a bit later. The real issue with attempting to make this new entry compatible for newcomers is the clumsy placement of exposition. Go and Sotsu have set themselves up to not only have to introduce elements in the same manner as the original, like Hinamizawa Syndrome and the basic group of main characters, but also with this conversation in episode 2, the show has also set itself up to have to explain the entirety of the original's narrative throughline, as well as its eventual outcome. Rika is 100 years deep into a time loop she's already escaped at the time of Go's beginning, and the series kneecaps its ability to unravel this as the original series does. Instead, Rika just tells you this in the second episode, and it's actually somewhat confusing. In the original series, there's a bit of a transition in terms of who the protagonist is. Keiichi is originally introduced as the protagonist, and the reasoning for this is sound. Keiichi is new in town, and so is the audience, so we can learn about Hinamizawa and its citizens and its school, its superstitions and its history, just as Keiichi does. Once the audience is more comfortable with the location, Rika takes on a greater role as the main character as her involvement with the time loop and the virus are revealed. In Go, Keiichi isn't given the sole spotlight, so the audience is keeping up with two stories simultaneously, Keiichi and learning about the village, and Rika learning about the supernatural. But of course, Rika isn't actually learning about the supernatural because she's been neck deep in it for a century, so instead, the audience has to learn this through heavy-handed exposition, or more commonly, through vagueness. If you're unfamiliar with the original series, then the supernatural elements are just a cat box of questions that largely go unanswered. Now, I don't like having to continuously compare Go to its predecessor, but the fact of the matter is that Go has set itself up for these comparisons by being A, a sequel to the original, and B, intentionally aping most of the original story beats. This gets worse as Go gets to the point where it has to try and recap the ending of the original series. For anyone who may not be aware, Mio Takano and Jiro Tomitake are major characters in the last legs of the original story, and carry the narrative weight of the ending seen in the flashback we get in this episode. But if you're a newcomer with no prior knowledge of Higurashi, you don't know who the fuck these characters are. You know their names, sure, if you remember them, but they have a handful of minutes of screen time between them before this flashback appears. So the show tries to rush an entire story arc of exposition in this small little flashback, and that kills the emotional weight this scene was clearly evoking with its somber tone. I mean, there's a reason for this flashback. It sets up that the episodes to follow all take place directly after the events of the original story. But that's the problem. If you're a newcomer, you don't know the original story, and the new series has done an awful job of conveying it. So instead, the writing is constantly bouncing around, trying to make sure nobody is lost, but at the same time getting bogged down in its own exposition, damaging the pacing, and again, failing to communicate emotional beats that it's clearly going for. There's a point where these aren't just references for older fans, it's an active part of the story that a big chunk of your intended audience won't get. Furthermore, if this is your entry point into the series, why would you be even remotely interested in the lives of the other club members? In Go, these characters don't serve as much more than tools through which murder is committed, and in Sotsu they are barely in the show at all. Which would be fine if you want to tell a new story, sure, I have no problems with Ryukishi writing a story where the club members all take a backseat to Rika and Satoko, but if that's what you're doing, it isn't a good entry point to the series. The story of Higurashi has already been resolved, and if you want to write a new entry to the franchise without introducing new characters, you have to either start the character development over from square one, alienating existing fans, or operate on character development seen in earlier story arcs, alienating new fans. Go and Sotsu managed to give us the worst of both worlds, with bizarre shifts in established character dynamics and shallow motivations that are never given the time to be fleshed out in depth. Almost every major character is a surface-level facsimile of what they were previously, which would be less of a problem if this wasn't a direct continuation of the original series. Now, things aren't all bad here. There are a few things worth praising in Go and Sotsu. For example, an examination of Rina Mamiya and Teppei Hojo. These two were blind villains in the original story arcs, essentially evil for its own sake. They weren't exactly deep, they just existed to bring misfortune to Reina and Satoko, respectively. In the new series, these two are given a lot more depth. Now, whether you think humanizing the famously abusive uncle is a good thing is a different question entirely. But it's interesting storytelling. It's... what's that word? Oh yeah, recontextualizing. Plus the animation of Go is pretty nice, the opening and ending themes are all absolutely fantastic, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't, at least at a few points, feel some of that same wonderful air of mystery that the original stories managed to convey. And as I mentioned, I do think the first episode is a strong introduction to the series, and Go as a whole is a decent enough watch that would absolutely be worth it if Sotsu didn't drop the ball immediately afterwards. All of my complaints about the poor storytelling are things that I really feel could have been resolved if the answer arcs were done well. Oh, about that.
王西学園生徒会開則4つ
Now, if you're unfamiliar, Higurashi as a franchise follows a certain structure of storytelling. Each of its time loops are individual story arcs, all of which are divided into question arcs and answer arcs. As those titles suggest, the question arcs are the first scenarios you see, setting up the tone and the mysteries to be solved. Answer arcs come later, and eventually give the requisite hints to figure out what happened in the question arcs if you didn't come to the right answer on your own. It's like a traditional mystery story. There's the crime, and then the detective reveals all at the very end and you get to compare your theories against the truth. Key here is that originally, question arcs and answer arcs were wildly different stories that shared enough mysteries and elements that viewing one was capable of providing hints on the other. The same basic timetable is adhered to, but we aren't viewing the same exact events from slightly different perspectives. We're seeing new events entirely. Take for example the second story arc of the originals, titled Watanagashi Hen. Told from the perspective of initial protagonist Keiichi Maebara, this story follows him and his relationship with identical twins Mion and Shion Sonozaki. Mion is an already established character present in the preceding story arc, but her sister Shion hasn't appeared in the story before this point. On your first run through the story arc, because of the twins' insecurities and proclivities, it's unclear to the audience at several points in the story as to which twin Keiichi is actually talking to. In fact, at first, Keiichi doesn't believe Mion even has a twin, and there's a chance that a first-time member of the audience won't believe that either until Shion actually shows up on screen for the first time. As the murders of this story arc play out, the question of the twins becomes even greater. Keiichi's paranoia gets the best of him, and this translates to the audience themselves. It's unclear as to which of the twins, if not both of them, is implicit in the murders, and the story arc ends with questions abound. Later on, this is all re-examined in the fifth story arc, Meyakashi Hen, which is an answer arc told from the perspective of Shion. While the end goal of this arc is to explain Watanagashi Hen, the audience is treated to completely new information along the way. We learn about Shion's troubled history at an all-girls school, the same school that shows up in Go and Sotsu, I might add, as well as Shion's close relationship to the Hojo family, and with Satoko's older brother in particular. The answer arc manages to provide answers on what happened in the question arc while also conveying a brand new story with scenes completely unrelated to what we saw with Keiichi. It wasn't just the same story, but from the murderer's perspective, it was something brand new. Sotsu, on the other hand, consists of 13 entire recap episodes, and that's on top of Go's story structure intentionally following very similar plotlines to the original story arcs. So little of this pair of shows actually consists of original content. Instead, we're just rehashing things over and over and over again. The answer arcs of Sotsu quite literally are the question arcs but from the murderer's perspective, and unlike the original stories, the culprit is the same every time and the audience already knows that. As soon as we know that the tragedies are orchestrated by Satoko and her Deus Ex syringe, you don't need to watch any of the answer arcs because the same theme plays out. Satoko injects someone, they start murdering, rinse, repeat. And to return to this point, if you're new to the series, this kills the examination of the histories of each character, because each of the actual killers are just tools used by the secret ultra culprit that is Satoko. So Sotsu has locked itself into Satoko's singular and boring perspective, with repeat after repeat after repeat after repeat. If this show was your first introduction to Higurashi, then I would genuinely love to know what was keeping you going at this point, because for me, the narrative investment was slipping, and slipping fast. And then, after 13 whole episodes of retelling the same story, Sotsu finally gets around to saying what it really wants to say. So let's get into that.
王妻学園生徒会開則5つ
As mentioned, Sotsu spends a lot of time recapping events we've already seen, but all that comes to an end in episode 14. You know, when we get back to the gun thing. After another murder-suicide, Satoko and Rika, now fully aware of the sins of the other, just start beating the shit out of each other over and over, and eventually their looper abilities manifest as Dragon Ball style aura energies, and their outfits change to these old Miko outfits, but you know, like as a uniform. And the two continue kicking the shit out of each other, but now with magic. And this goes on and back and forth for 20 or so minutes, until the episode just sort of ends. Now, on the surface, this isn't the worst thing in the world. If you're not invested in the series at this point, and why would you be? It's a fun little turn your brain off kind of thing, where you just enjoy the ride. You know, the kind of thing Higurashi has always prided itself on. Mindless entertainment. That's what we all come to Higurashi for, right? This episode was pretty contentious upon release. For a lot of viewers, it was the jump the shark moment, where they realized that the show had completely given up on its intended methods of storytelling. For others, this was the culmination of everything the series had been building to, with the intermittent appearances of Hanyu and Ewa and the conflicting ideals of Rika and Satoko, all finally coming to a head. Regardless of where you fall on the spectrum, I'd like to take a look at what the intention of this storytelling was in the first place. Now, despite all the comparisons I've made, I don't think Go and Sotsu were actually trying to retread ground the original stories already covered. There was an intention of conveying a new story, one of the question of the future. Rika and Satoko have always been the focus of this new story, and it makes sense that the climax is a clash of their ideals. But is this fight really meant to be a culmination of that? A key part of this fight, at least in this episode, is this sword, a magical object that can permanently kill beings that live in these eternal loops. This is something that was set up much earlier, with a particularly despairing moment in Go where Rika attempts to take the sword only to realize it was gone and only a shard remained. For the entirety of this fight, the two are chasing after this sword, ostensibly to at least prevent the other from using it, if not using it themselves. Now, if we were going as abstract as possible, we could say this sword is a metaphor for their control of the future, and whoever has it in their possession will get what they want, but that kind of thinking fails on two fronts. One, the sword's purpose as a game-changing MacGuffin has been an ever-present part of the new series, and hasn't been built on in a way that elucidates this point. If the writing here was to convey that the sword isn't just a sword, then it's done a pretty poor job of that. Secondly, in the next episode they just drop the sword and neither one of them brings it up again. This fight actually would have been better without the sword if the two of them were actually just throwing punches over ideals instead of more literally fighting over a super special weapon. I'm not even going to question the use of magic in this Dragon Ball stuff, because at this point Ryukishi was just making sure everyone in the audience was getting a firm reach around. Oh look everyone, it's the chair scene! Oh look, it's the roof scene! Hey, that's a reference to that thing! Oh, Rika's announcing her attacks in the form of rules, where have I seen that before? Like, this doesn't even make fucking sense. Wonder why Rika's aura is blue and Satoko's is green? Well, I can give you a few hints as to where you can find it.
王妻学園生徒会開則6つ
At its core, Sotsu is about Rika and Satoko, two, friends, who both have individual dreams of what kind of future that they want. These futures share one thing in common. Rika wants her future to include Satoko, and Satoko wants her future to include Rika. What they disagree on is everything else. Rika wants to move on, to leave behind the village she spent a literal century being tortured in, to live a life alongside her friend in Greater Japan. Satoko, conversely, wants to stay with her friends forever. She's resilient to change, and as seen in Go, believes moving on will inevitably involve losing her closeness to Rika, regardless of what Rika says to the contrary. What's more frustrating is that Satoko knows Rika's motivation the entire time. One of the first things she does upon getting her powers is go back and watch every single loop that Rika experienced in the original story. She knows why Rika wants to leave the village, and there's interesting character conflict to be examined here. But it isn't. Satoko doesn't really bring up Rika's Century of Torment. At no point does she express any real feelings about it at all. Her watching Rika's past lives is more of a plot device to get Satoko up to speed with the viewer, but this isn't mined for any character conflict whatsoever. And that's not to say that Rika is innocent in all of this either. Her desire to move on is independent of Satoko's personal feelings, and she is more than happy to put Satoko into demonstrably uncomfortable situations for the sake of forcing growth. If only Rika's selfishness had been explored in some other arc that was already written before this point, like say, 15 years ago? Saikoroshi Hen, written in 2006, explores this exact question in depth. Rika finds herself in a time loop unique to all others. Her friends are miraculously free of the trauma that plagues their past in every other loop. As a consequence, however, the Rika who lived in this loop originally lacks any kind of close friendship with them. Rika struggles with whether it's even ethically right for her to want to return to a world where her friends have experienced hurt just because of the personal value of their friendship, and it's at this point where she begins to actually grapple with how being an immortal time looper has alienated her from human values. Like everything else in Sotsu, this particular story has already been told, and been told better, and I don't see what the intention was in revisiting this. By going over this whole thing again, Rika's character development has been retroactively cheapened, and both her and Satoko had to act in ways quite incongruous with their original characters to make the story work. Satoko has struggled with codependency for the entire story. It's part of her whole thing. But of course you have to go back to the originals if you really want to see the source of this. Sotsu follows this to an extreme but doesn't actually resolve it in the end. Was a good fistfight all it took to remove a lifetime of fear and trauma? I sure fucking hope not. I think the ideas behind Go and Sotsu are sound. At first the story seems to be exploring how Satoko would struggle with the inevitability of growing apart that's typical of childhood friendships, and especially how this would be handled in regards to her past and her under-examined relationship with Rika. From this perspective, I can absolutely see where her fear would eventually manifest into going to the greatest extremes to prevent any semblance of abandonment. But this idea is quickly dropped as Satoko's powers are fully realized and she morphs into the aforementioned ultra culprit, whose actions don't seem to actually correlate with keeping her friends around her in any way. All the torture and so on does not align with this at all, and doesn't seem to prove any kind of point to Rika or anyone else for that matter. There's a point of indulgence that is crossed early on that the show never recovers from, and Satoko's motivation is lost alongside it. Before we get to our final flaw, let's do a quick lightning round of smaller complaints I couldn't fit elsewhere. Hey, remember how everyone shat on the original anime for being a gore fest that misrepresents the merits of the franchise as a whole? It's a good thing Go and Sotsu aren't just that, but worse.
God, why did you dig that clip up?
Even if you wanted the answer arcs to be the same as the question arcs but from Satoko's perspective, couldn't you have at least reanimated these sequences instead of just copy-pasting half of every episode? Remember how I said Shion had a close relationship with the Hojo family? Why isn't any of this examined when Satoko is given the spotlight? Satoshi, Shion, Irie, none of them are given more than a passing thought the whole series. I'm actually kind of offended that they brought back Dear You as the final ending song, as if this was the big culmination all of Higurashi was building to, like this montage of background characters was at all earned. Yeah, the song's good, but the show that preceded it was very much not. Again, what was the point of the sword?
王妻学園生徒会開塞7つ
For anyone who doesn't know, Ryukishi has done a lot of writing in his time, and aside from Higurashi, there are two other franchises that share the When They Cry moniker, Umineko and Seconia, or Kikonia, whatever. These three franchises don't explicitly share the same universe or anything, but there are a lot of similarities connecting them. This is typically in the form of crossover characters. Ryukishi has said this is because certain characters could be seen more as actors who portray different roles in different stories. So they are connected. Kind of. Are they? Who's to say? Well, I can tell you who. Fucking Ryukishi. Ever since Umineko first came out, Ryukishi has been relentless in referencing things from it and making small connections between the franchises here and there. What he won't do is make it actually explicit, and in Sotsu he is towing this line as closely as he can. Take the character of Ewa. In Umineko, the most powerful being in the story is a witch named Featherine, who shares a suspiciously similar appearance to Awa. She looks like Featherine, acts like Featherine, has the powers of Featherine, and makes very little narrative sense as a character unless you already know who Featherine is. Like, if you watch this series as an entry point to When They Cry, what did you get out of this cackling background character? Did her horn cracking make literally any sense to you as a resolution to her storyline? Awa as a whole is such an unnecessary addition, especially because no guys, that's totally not Featherine at all. I would never do something like directly connect one of my franchises to another. Ryukishi explicitly compares this to the concept of a star system, a Japanese term that is similar to the shared universe thing that Western media is so into right now. So, if he's gonna go down that route, I'd like to quickly demonstrate where this concept works and why it isn't working here. One of Japan's most prolific artists in the world of anime and manga is Leiji Matsumoto. This man has done a ton of work in the realm of space operas and science fiction, and even if you haven't seen his work, there's a good chance you at least recognize a few of them. Most likely Galaxy Express 999 and Space Pirate Captain Harlock. His series all vaguely take place in the same universe, but also at the same time quite explicitly don't. For this example, we'll look at the character Emeraldus, who appears in several of the franchises that Matsumoto has penned. She is the twin sister of this character from Galaxy Express 999, and her character history is quite different depending on when you first saw her. The scar on her face seemingly first shows up in the Harlock film Arcadia of My Youth, when she is shot mid-battle. But in her own series, Queen Emeraldus, the scar is from being slashed in a duel against a villain named Siren. Furthermore, in Queen Emeraldus, she is a capable fighter and one of the most feared captains in the universe. In Galaxy Express 999, she has a terminal illness that isn't present elsewhere and is almost always bedridden. In the Captain Harlock franchise, she claims to have a younger brother but doesn't mention her twin sister. But also her brother is never mentioned in any other franchise Emeraldus appears in. The point to be made here is that, sure, the character's showing up again, but no one at home is under the impression that if they connect the dots in just the right way, they can create a coherent timeline linking all of Emeraldus' appearances together. You are capable of just enjoying an independent franchise while also appreciating the appearance of a character you already like. And When They Cry, this is never the case, due to how cagey Ryukishi is when it comes to connecting his franchises together. There's always an excuse to be made about how Higurashi connects to Umineko and how Umineko connects to Kikonia, and so forth. As an author, if you're going to make these connections, then you have to actually make them, and not just prance around them hoping that these references will carry people into the next project. It's one thing to have little references like characters sharing names, and another entirely to do this. I always suspected this would happen in Sotsu because it's something Ryukishi has been doing for years now, and every week people were excited because this story was supposed to be the big prequel to Umineko, and every week these expectations would be for fucking naught. I would love for this section of this video to age poorly, for it all to somehow be building up to something, but I don't think it will. I think Ryukishi will name drop miracles and certainty until the end of time, but I don't think he will ever actually connect these franchises in any meaningful capacity. If I'm being honest, I think the When They Cry franchise is getting a bit too big for Ryukishi to handle on his own. He's stuck walking this extremely fine line. On the one hand, he wants to keep his work somewhat accessible to potential fans, so he can't make one franchise explicitly rely on another, or else the barrier of entry will be too high. But on the other hand, he has invested so much time in making disparate references between franchises that he has crippled their ability to stand on their own merits. If you want to talk about Higurashi nowadays, you almost can't without bringing up Umineko, and if things continue along this line, this will only get worse with later releases of Kikonia. I really love these franchises, and I hope that Ryukishi can somehow wrangle them all together at some point in the future, but I think it's time to take a step back and consider if we really know where we're going with all of this. Also, I really hope they don't try to make a Umineko anime again. I don't think it would work as an anime, even if they really, really tried. Bye!
私たち世界が口が動きます。